The uneasy discovery. Jim Stevenson had served as a park ranger for over a decade, a role he cherished deeply. His days were spent amidst nature's wonders, ensuring the safety of the park's wildlife and its visitors. Every morning, he walked the same trails, greeted by familiar sights and sounds: rustling leaves, chirping birds, and the occasional scampering deer. The park was a sanctuary, not just for its inhabitants, but for Jim, who felt a profound connection to its serenity. One particular nest stood out to Jim. Nestled high in an ancient oak tree, it had become a personal favorite on his patrol route. The nest, likely belonging to a family of hawks, had been a marvel to watch over the years. Jim had observed its growth, from a modest cluster of twigs to a sprawling structure that seemed to dominate the tree. The hawks were a constant source of life and activity, their sharp cries and aerial displays a familiar melody in the park. But on this day, something was off. As Jim approached the tree, an unnatural silence hung in the air. Gone were the usual sounds of chirping and rustling from the nest. The tree seemed eerily still, devoid of the life that had always animated it. Jim slowed his steps, his gaze fixed on the nest, trying to spot any movement. There was none. This wasn't normal. The absence of noise sent a chill down Jim's spine. He scanned the area, hoping to catch sight of the hawks. But the ground around the tree was barren, undisturbed by any sign of recent activity. Normally, feathers or broken twigs might litter the area, evidence of the hawks' bustling lives. Today, it was as though the nest had been abandoned overnight. Jim's instincts told him something was wrong, but he hesitated to act. Wildlife had its rhythms and mysteries, and he knew better than to interfere without reason. Perhaps the hawks were out hunting or had relocated, though the latter seemed unlikely. This was their home, and hawks were territorial creatures. Still, Jim decided to wait and observe. Tomorrow, he would return and check again. That night, Jim couldn't shake the unease. The silence of the nest gnawed at him, its stillness replaying in his mind. He tried to convince himself that everything was fine, but a lingering sense of dread crept into his thoughts. As he lay in bed, his mind wandered to the worst possibilities: predation, disease, or even human interference. He hoped fervently that the morning would bring answers, and the familiar cries of the hawks. Part 2. The Silent Tree. Early the next morning, Jim set out on his patrol earlier than usual. The unease from the previous day pushed him to move quickly, his boots crunching against the gravel trail as he neared the ancient oak. From a distance, the tree appeared unchanged, its massive branches stretching skyward. But as Jim drew closer, the ominous silence persisted. He approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the base of the tree for any clues. That's when he noticed something unusual: marks on the ground. They were faint but distinct, like impressions left by tools or heavy equipment. Jim crouched to examine them, his brows furrowing. These marks weren't made by any animal he knew. They seemed deliberate, almost methodical. His pulse quickened. Could this be evidence of human activity? If so, what were they doing here, and why? Jim's gaze shifted upward to the nest. He couldn't see inside it from the ground, and the thought of what might be hidden there filled him with a mix of dread and curiosity. Grabbing his radio, he called the ranger station to report the findings. "I'm seeing some unusual activity near the big oak on Trail 7, he said. "There are marks on the ground. Looks like tools were used. I'm going to investigate further." "Understood," came the reply. "Be careful, Jim. Call us if you find anything serious." Returning to his truck, Jim retrieved a ladder and some tools. He was determined to get a closer look at the nest. If there was something wrong, he needed to know. As he set up the ladder against the tree, a wave of apprehension washed over him. What would he find? The climb was nerve-wracking. The ladder wobbled slightly as Jim ascended, his eyes fixed on the nest above. Normally, the hawks would react to his approach, their cries a mix of warning and curiosity. Today, there was only silence. Reaching the nest, Jim was struck by its state. A large hole gaped in its side, as though something, or someone, had deliberately torn it open. The damage was too precise to be the result of weather or animal activity. His breath caught as he peered inside. It was empty. No hawks, no eggs, but it wasn't entirely vacant. Something small and metallic glinted among the twigs and feathers. Jim reached in carefully, his fingers brushing against the object. Pulling it out, he found a strange device, a small box-like contraption with blinking lights. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Jim's heart raced. This was no ordinary discovery. The device was evidence of human interference, and its presence in the nest raised alarming questions. Who had placed it there, and why? Was it connected to the marks on the ground? Descending the ladder, Jim's mind swirled with possibilities. He knew he had to act quickly. Back on the ground, he pulled out his phone and called the police. Shadows in the park. The police officer on the other end of the call sounded skeptical. A strange device in a bird's nest. Are you sure it's not just some kid's lost drone part or a forgotten wildlife tracker? Jim tightened his grip on the phone. I've worked this park for over 10 years. I know what belongs here and what doesn't. This device wasn't lost by accident. There are marks on the ground, deliberate ones, and the nest was tampered with. This isn't natural. After a pause, the officer sighed. We'll make a note of it, but without clear evidence of a crime, there's not much we can do. Keep an eye on it, and let us know if anything else turns up. Jim hung up, his frustration mounting. He pocketed his phone and stared at the device in his hand. It was cold and smooth, its lights blinking rhythmically. This wasn't something someone accidentally dropped while birdwatching. The hawk's disappearance, the marks on the ground. And now this, none of it sat right. Determined not to let it go, Jim decided to document everything. He retrieved his camera from his truck and began snapping photos of the nest, the ground around the tree, and the device itself. Every detail could be a clue, and if the police wouldn't take him seriously, he'd gather enough evidence to change their minds. As he worked, a faint sound reached his ears, a rustling in the underbrush, subtle but distinct. Jim froze, his camera mid-shot. He scanned the area, but saw nothing. The noise came again, this time from a different direction, as though something, or someone, was circling him. "Hello," he called out, his voice firm, but wary. "Is someone there?" No response. Jim's pulse quickened. He set the camera down and grabbed his flashlight, shining its beam into the dense foliage. The trees and shrubs cast eerie shadows, their shapes shifting with the light. The rustling stopped, leaving the forest in an unnerving silence. Probably an animal, Jim muttered to himself, though he wasn't convinced. The marks on the ground and the device in the nest hinted at something far more deliberate than a curious raccoon or deer. He packed up his equipment, including the strange device, and returned to the ranger station. There, he locked the device in a secure drawer and began reviewing his notes and photos. He combed through the images, zooming in on the details, the precise cuts in the nest, the organized patterns of the marks on the ground, and the peculiar smoothness of the device. As the hours passed, the sun began to set, casting the park in a golden hue. Jim's unease grew with the fading light. He decided to patrol the area around the oak tree again before calling it a night. If someone was tampering with the wildlife, they might return under the cover of darkness. The night watch. The park took on an entirely different character at night. The familiar trails and trees, so welcoming during the day, now seemed shrouded in mystery. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and every sound was amplified. The hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Jim parked his truck near the tree and stepped out, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The oak loomed ahead, its massive branches blending into the night sky. Jim approached cautiously, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The marks on the ground were still there, untouched since earlier. He knelt down, running his fingers over them. They were faint but distinct, like tracks left by something heavy being dragged. Nearby, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a faint glint of metal buried in the dirt. Using his pocket knife, Jim carefully dug around the object. It was a shard of metal, small but sharp, with jagged edges. It looked like it had been torn from something larger, though what that might have been was unclear. He bagged it, adding it to the growing collection of evidence. As he straightened up, a sound made him freeze, a low hum, barely audible but persistent. It seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the woods, a mechanical noise that didn't belong in the natural stillness of the park. Jim hesitated, his instincts warning him to stay put, but curiosity and a sense of duty pushed him forward. He followed the sound, moving carefully through the underbrush. The hum grew louder, accompanied by faint flashes of light filtering through the trees. Jim's heart raced as he crept closer, his flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. Ahead, in a small clearing, he saw them. Two figures dressed in dark clothing, illuminated by the glow of portable lights. They were hunched over a strange device, their movements quick and deliberate. The machine emitted the low hum Jim had heard, its purpose a mystery. Jim crouched behind a tree, his breathing shallow. He couldn't see their faces, but their actions were methodical, as though they'd done this before. One of them lifted a cage, empty, but large enough to hold a small animal, and placed it near the device. The other fiddled with the machine, adjusting knobs and levers. Wildlife smugglers, Jim thought, his suspicions confirmed. They were using the park as a staging ground, likely targeting rare species. The nest must have been part of their operation, a place to stash their loot before transport. Jim reached for his radio, but as he adjusted his position, a twig snapped under his boot. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the still night. The figures froze, their heads snapping toward the noise. One of them muttered something Jim couldn't make out, and they both began scanning the trees with flashlights. Jim's heart pounded as he pressed himself against the trunk, willing himself to disappear. The beams of light swept dangerously close, but after a tense moment, the figures seemed to lose interest. They returned to their work, though their movements were more hurried now. Jim retreated slowly, careful not to make any more noise. Once he was a safe distance away, he broke into a run, heading straight for his truck. His mind raced as he started the engine and drove back to the station. A call for reinforcements. Back at the station, Jim didn't waste time. He called the police again, his voice urgent. "I've got evidence now. People in the park at night, setting up equipment in cages. This isn't some harmless prank or misunderstanding. It's illegal, and it's happening right now." This time, the officer on the line took him seriously. "Stay at the station and wait for backup. We'll send a unit your way." Jim hung up and began preparing. He reviewed the photos and notes once more, organizing everything for the officers. His thoughts were a whirlwind of worry and determination. If these smugglers were caught, it could mean the difference between life and death for the park's wildlife. But as he sat waiting for the police, a thought struck him. If the smugglers realized they'd been seen, they might flee before help arrived. Jim couldn't let that happen. Grabbing his flashlight and a camera, Jim headed back out into the night, determined to keep an eye on the clearing. The park, his park, was under threat, and he wasn't about to let it go without a fight. Into the shadows, Jim navigated the dark trails of the park with a blend of urgency and caution. Every instinct told him that what he had stumbled upon was far bigger than he initially imagined. His flashlight remained off, and he moved carefully, relying on the faint light of the moon to guide him. Somewhere deep in the woods, the smugglers were conducting their operation. Jim's goal was clear: keep them in sight until the police arrived. The silence of the forest was unnerving. Every snap of a twig under his boots felt deafening, and every gust of wind through the leaves made his pulse quicken. But Jim pushed forward, his determination outweighing his fear. He knew these people posed a serious threat, not only to the park's wildlife, but potentially to anyone who stumbled upon their illegal activities. When Jim neared the clearing where he'd seen the figures earlier, he crouched low and approached with extreme care. The hum of the machine was still audible, a low, droning sound that carried through the night. He could see faint lights spilling through the trees ahead, and as he drew closer, the scene unfolded once again before him. The smugglers were still there, their dark figures moving around the clearing. They seemed tense, as if they were on high alert. Jim suspected his earlier misstep had spooked them. One of the smugglers spoke in a low voice, their words too muffled for Jim to make out, but the tone was sharp, almost scolding. Jim adjusted his position, angling for a better view. He could see them more clearly now. Two individuals, one male and one female, both dressed in black tactical gear. The male was working on the strange device, while the female appeared to be scanning their surroundings with a flashlight, her movements deliberate and precise. Between them was a cluster of items, cages of varying sizes, a small generator powering their equipment, and several sealed crates. The crates bore no markings, but their pristine condition suggested they were not local. Suddenly, the woman froze. Her flashlight beam stopped, focused on a particular spot in the trees. Jim held his breath, pressing himself against the trunk of a nearby oak. Had she seen him? For a long, agonizing moment, she remained still, her flashlight fixed in his general direction. Then, as though deciding it was nothing, she turned back to the clearing and resumed her patrol. Jim exhaled silently, his heart pounding in his chest. A closer look. Jim needed to get closer. He knew the police were on their way, but he wanted to gather more evidence before they arrived. Something undeniable that could ensure these smugglers were apprehended and prosecuted. Slowly, he crept around the clearing, staying low and using the underbrush for cover. As he moved, he caught sight of the male smuggler opening one of the crates. Jim strained to see its contents, his curiosity piqued. What he saw sent a jolt through him. Inside the crate were several large eggs, each carefully cushioned in foam padding. They were unlike anything Jim had seen before, smooth, iridescent, and emitting a faint glow under the light of the smuggler's flashlight. Exotic animal eggs. That explained everything. The strange device, the cages, and the disappearance of the hawks. The smugglers were using the park as a temporary holding site for their illegal trade. The hawk's nest, Jim realized, had likely been a hiding spot for the eggs or a decoy for their operations. Jim snapped a few photos, careful to silence the shutter on his camera. The evidence was damning, but he needed to see more. What species were these eggs from? Were the smugglers transporting them, or were they actively hatching something dangerous? As he shifted for a better angle, his hand brushed against something cold and metallic. Startled, Jim looked down and found another strange device partially buried in the dirt. Smaller than the one in the nest, but of similar design, it seemed to be some kind of tracker or sensor. He carefully picked it up and examined it, noting a blinking light and a series of numbers etched into the casing. Jim pocketed the device, knowing it might be crucial evidence. Just as he did, the male smuggler let out a sharp whistle, a signal to his partner. Jim froze again, his heart racing. The female smuggler responded with urgency, rushing back to the man's side. "They're moving fast," she said, her voice clear now. "We don't have much time. Wrap it up." The escape plan. The smugglers began packing their equipment with practiced efficiency. The male closed the crate of eggs and secured it with heavy-duty straps, while the female dismantled the strange machine. They worked quickly, their movements precise and synchronized. It was clear this wasn't their first operation. Jim realized he was running out of time. If they packed up and disappeared into the night, the police might not arrive in time to catch them. He reached for his radio to relay the urgency of the situation. "This is Ranger Stevenson," he whispered into the device. "I've got 2 individuals in the eastern clearing near the old oak. They're packing up now, moving fast. They have exotic animal eggs and equipment. Over." The response was immediate. "Copy that, Stevenson." Units are en route. Stay hidden and don't engage. Jim acknowledged the order but couldn't help feeling a rising sense of anxiety. The smugglers were nearly done, and the hum of their machine had ceased, plunging the clearing into an eerie silence. The female smuggler suddenly paused, her head tilting as though she'd heard something. She gestured to her partner, and they both turned their flashlights outward, scanning the perimeter. "We're not alone," she said sharply. Jim ducked lower, his pulse thundering in his ears. He hadn't made a sound, had he? The smugglers moved with military precision, each taking a side of the clearing as they searched for the source of the disturbance. Caught in the act. As they advanced, Jim's mind raced. He had to act quickly. If they found him, there was no telling what they'd do. He considered retreating but realized he was too close to the clearing. Any sudden movement would give him away. Instead, he decided to create a diversion. Reaching into his pocket, he found a small rock and tossed it into the bushes opposite his position. The sound of rustling foliage drew the smugglers' attention immediately, and they rushed toward the noise with their flashlights blazing. Jim seized the moment to reposition himself, slipping farther back into the shadows. From his new vantage point, he could see the smugglers examining the area where the rock had landed. Their frustration was evident as they found nothing. "Let's go," the male said finally. "We've wasted enough time." The female hesitated but eventually nodded. They returned to their equipment, hastily loading everything into 2 large duffel bags. Jim watched as they lifted the crates, struggling slightly under their weight. "Almost done," the male muttered. Jim knew the police were close, but would they make it in time? The smugglers were on the verge of disappearing into the night, taking their illicit cargo with them. The sound of sirens. Just as the smugglers were about to leave, a distant sound broke the silence. The wail of approaching sirens. The smugglers froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the noise. Panic flashed across their faces, and they scrambled to pick up their equipment. "Move," the female barked, her voice laced with urgency. Jim stayed hidden, watching as the smugglers rushed toward a concealed path at the edge of the clearing. But as they fled, one of them dropped something, a small black pouch that tumbled to the ground unnoticed. The sirens grew louder, and moments later, beams of light pierced the darkness as police vehicles arrived at the scene. Officers poured out, their flashlights and weapons at the ready. "Ranger Stevenson," one of them called out. "Where are they?" Jim emerged from the shadows, pointing toward the path. "They went that way. They're carrying crates, exotic animal eggs. They have equipment too." The officers nodded, splitting into teams to pursue the smugglers. Jim picked up the dropped pouch, curious about its contents. Inside, he found a collection of small vials filled with an unknown liquid, labeled with strange symbols. Whatever this operation was, it went deeper than he'd imagined. And Jim had a feeling the night's events were just the beginning. The chase through the shadows. The forest erupted with chaos as the police began their pursuit. Officers, guided by Jim's directions, fanned out into the woods, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The smugglers, now fully aware of the authorities closing in, moved with desperation. The sound of heavy boots crashing through underbrush echoed through the trees, accompanied by the occasional sharp command from the officers. Jim stayed back, knowing he wasn't equipped for a direct confrontation, but his role was far from over. The pouch he had found weighed heavily in his hands, its mysterious contents demanding his attention. He set it aside momentarily, focusing instead on documenting everything around him. His camera captured the abandoned clearing, the equipment the smugglers had left behind, and the trail of trampled foliage marking their escape route. The sound of running feet and muffled voices faded as the police gave chase. Jim turned his attention back to the pouch. Inside were 6 small vials, each filled with a liquid that seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the faint light. The labels on the vials were marked with symbols Jim didn't recognize, curved lines and dots arranged in patterns that seemed almost alien. His mind raced with possibilities. What was this liquid? a sedative for the animals, some kind of genetic experiment. He couldn't dwell on it. The smugglers were still out there, and the safety of the park was at stake. A shocking discovery. While the police pursued the fleeing criminals, Jim decided to follow another lead. The equipment the smugglers had left behind was scattered across the clearing, and it was clear they'd abandoned it in haste. Among the items was the strange machine that had produced the eerie hum. Jim approached it cautiously, noting its odd design. It was compact yet intricate, with wires and tubes snaking across its surface. A faint glow emanated from a small screen, which displayed a series of numbers and letters in rapid succession. Jim didn't dare touch it. Instead, he used his camera to take detailed photos of the machine. His years of experience in the park had taught him to recognize most standard equipment used by researchers and conservationists, but this device was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its design was too advanced, too sophisticated for a simple wildlife operation. Nearby, he found a small notebook. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and diagrams, but they were written in a language he didn't understand. The symbols resembled the ones on the vials, further deepening the mystery. Jim carefully flipped through the notebook, his unease growing with each page. Whatever these smugglers were doing, it was far more elaborate than illegal animal trafficking. A sudden crackling noise on his radio jolted him from his thoughts. "Stevenson, this is Officer Harris. We've cornered one of them near the Northern Trail. The other is still on the move." Jim grabbed his radio. "Understood. I'll meet you at the trailhead." He secured the pouch, the notebook, and his camera before heading back to his truck. As he drove toward the Northern Trail, his mind raced. The evidence he collected painted a disturbing picture, but he still didn't have the full story. And with one of the smugglers still at large, the situation remained far from resolved. The interrogation. When Jim arrived at the trailhead, he found a group of officers surrounding the female smuggler. She was restrained, her hands cuffed behind her back, but she still radiated defiance. Her dark tactical gear was scuffed and torn, and a cut on her forehead suggested she hadn't gone down without a fight. Officer Harris approached Jim. "She's not saying much, but we recovered some of the crates and equipment she was carrying. You were right. They've been using the park as a base for trafficking exotic species. But there's more to this than we expected." Harris gestured toward one of the crates, now sitting in the back of a police truck. Jim peered inside and saw more of the strange glowing eggs. Unlike the ones he'd seen earlier, these were slightly cracked, revealing faintly pulsing veins beneath their shells. "These aren't just smuggled goods," Harris said, his voice low. "They're alive, and they're not anything we've ever seen before." Jim felt a chill run down his spine. He turned his attention to the captured smuggler, who was glaring at him with icy determination. "What are these?" he asked her, gesturing to the eggs. "What were you doing here?" She didn't respond, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll find out eventually," Harris said. "For now, we need to secure these and track down her partner." A race against time. Jim couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The second smuggler was still at large, and Jim suspected he was carrying the most critical piece of the operation, the remaining eggs, or perhaps something even more dangerous. Determined to help, Jim suggested they set up surveillance near the park's exit points. "He's desperate," Jim said. "If he knows we've got his partner, he'll try to get out of the park as quickly as possible." Harris agreed, dispatching officers to the park's various entry and exit points. Jim joined one of the teams, positioning himself near the southern gate. Armed with his flashlight and camera, he waited in the shadows, every nerve on edge. Hours passed. The forest remained eerily quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal animals drowned out by the tension in the air. Just when Jim began to think the smuggler had slipped through their grasp, he heard a faint noise, a rustling in the underbrush, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing. He signaled the officers nearby, who moved into position. The rustling grew louder, and then the smuggler emerged, carrying a large duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He paused, glancing around as if sensing the trap, but it was too late. "Freeze!" Harris shouted, his flashlight beam illuminating the smuggler. "Drop the bag and put your hands where I can see them." The smuggler hesitated for a moment before bolting back into the woods. Jim and the officers gave chase, their flashlights spotting wildly as they navigated the uneven terrain. The smuggler was fast, but his heavy bag slowed him down. Finally, he stumbled, the bag slipping from his grasp. Jim reached him first, tackling him to the ground. The officers quickly secured the smuggler, ensuring he couldn't escape again. Unveiling the truth. With both smugglers in custody, the officers began collecting the remaining evidence. The duffel bag contained more eggs as well as additional equipment and documents. Among the items was a small locked case. When opened, it revealed a device similar to the one Jim had found in the nest, but this one was active, its screen displaying a series of coordinates. "This is it," Jim said, pointing to the screen. "This is where they were taking the eggs." The coordinates pointed to a remote location far from the park, raising questions about the smugglers' ultimate goal. Were they working for a larger organization? Was this part of an international trafficking ring? And what role did the strange machines and liquids play? As dawn broke over the park, Jim felt a mix of relief and unease. The immediate danger had been dealt with, but the mystery surrounding the operation was far from solved. One thing was certain: the smugglers weren't just targeting exotic animals. They were part of something much bigger, and Jim was determined to uncover the truth. The hidden network. As dawn spread its golden light over the park, Jim found himself seated in the ranger station, surrounded by evidence: crates of glowing eggs, the mysterious files, the strange machine, and the confiscated notebook. The captured smugglers were being transported to a secure facility for questioning, but Jim knew that the most crucial pieces of the puzzle were right here. Officer Harris entered the station, holding the small locked case that contained the active device with coordinates. "The tech guys are looking into this now," he said. "But Stevenson, I have to ask, how in the world did you stumble onto all this? Exotic eggs, mysterious liquids. This is bigger than anything we've dealt with in this region." Jim leaned forward, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't stumble on it. It stumbled on me. It started with the hawk's nest. Something was off, and I couldn't ignore it. The nest, the marks on the ground, the strange device inside. It all pointed to something unnatural happening here. And now here we are." Harris nodded, looking over the collected evidence. "And here we are indeed. But this," he said, gesturing to the eggs and devices, "this is unlike anything we've seen before. What are these eggs? And what's their connection to these machines?" Jim sighed. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." Decoding the notebook. The confiscated notebook was proving to be one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence. Jim sat at a table, flipping through its pages, while Harris coordinated with his team. The symbols and diagrams inside seemed almost cryptographic, as though written in a code. There were crude drawings of what appeared to be the eggs, alongside sketches of strange machinery that bore a resemblance to the device found in the nest. Jim noticed a recurring symbol, a circular design with jagged lines radiating outward. It was drawn beside nearly every diagram and note. "What is this?" he muttered to himself, tracing the design with his finger. The more he studied the notebook, the more he realized the smugglers weren't just transporting these eggs. They were experimenting with them. In the back of the notebook, Jim found a series of partially translated notes. Phrases like genetic manipulation, habitat introduction, and rapid incubation stood out, sending a chill down his spine. These weren't just stolen animal eggs. They were part of a larger, potentially dangerous experiment. The biologist's analysis. By mid-morning, a biologist from the State Wildlife Department, Dr. Emily Carter, arrived to examine the eggs. She was a short woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She immediately set to work, her gloved hands carefully removing one of the eggs from a crate. "These are extraordinary," she said, her voice filled with awe. "I've never seen anything like them. The structure of the shell, the faint glow. This isn't natural." Jim watched as Dr. Carter used a small scanner to examine the egg's interior. The machine emitted a series of beeps before displaying a detailed image on its screen. Inside the egg, a small creature was curled tightly, its form partially obscured by the glowing fluid surrounding it. "This isn't an endangered species we know about," Dr. Carter continued, her tone growing more serious. "Whatever is inside these eggs, it's not something native to this region, or perhaps even this planet." Jim felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean, not from this planet?" Dr. Carter glanced at him, her expression grim. "I mean the DNA signature is anomalous. It doesn't match any known terrestrial species. If I didn't know better, I'd say these eggs are genetically engineered. And if that's the case, someone, or some organization, is playing God." The smuggler talks. Later that afternoon, Harris called Jim to the interrogation room. The female smuggler, now identified as Claire Bennett, had begun to speak, though cautiously. Jim entered the room, his curiosity piqued. Claire sat at the table, her hands cuffed in front of her. Her defiance from the previous night had waned, replaced by a guarded but cooperative demeanor. Harris leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "We know you were working with a partner," Harris said. "And we know you were transporting these eggs. What we don't understand is why. Talk, and it might help your case." Claire hesitated, her eyes flicking between Harris and Jim. Finally, she spoke. "You don't get it, do you? These aren't just eggs. They're part of a breakthrough. A revolution." Jim frowned. "A revolution for what?" "For science," Claire said, leaning forward. "For the future. Those eggs represent decades of research. The creatures inside them were designed to adapt to any environment, to thrive where native species fail. Imagine deserts blooming with life, barren lands transformed into ecosystems. That's what this is about." Harris scoffed. "And you're saying you're the good guys? That this isn't about profit?" Claire's jaw tightened. "Of course there's profit, but the science comes first. If you destroy those eggs, you're destroying the future." Jim felt a wave of anger rise in him. "And what about the hawks? What about the damage you've already done to this park's ecosystem? You think you can play God without consequences?" Claire's eyes met his, cold and unyielding. "Consequences are necessary for progress." The coordinates from the smuggler's device led to a remote location outside the park, a warehouse on the outskirts of a small industrial town. Jim and Harris joined a team of officers as they prepared to raid the site. The tension in the air was palpable as they approached the warehouse, its imposing structure looming in the fading light of evening. "This is it," Harris said, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "If this is their base, we'll find everything we need to shut this operation down." The officers moved in swiftly, surrounding the building and cutting off any potential escape routes. Jim stayed close to Harris as they entered, the interior of the warehouse bathed in dim, flickering light. Inside, they found rows of equipment, incubators, refrigeration units, and more of the strange machines like the one Jim had found in the nest. Crates of eggs were stacked neatly in one corner, each labeled with coordinates indicating where they were intended to be delivered. But the most shocking discovery was at the center of the warehouse, a massive tank filled with a glowing, viscous liquid. Inside, a fully developed creature floated, its form both alien and familiar. It had sleek, scaled limbs, a streamlined body, and eyes that seemed to glow faintly even in the tank's dim light. Jim stared in stunned silence. What is that?" Dr. Carter, who had joined the team for the raid, stepped forward, her face pale. This isn't just genetic engineering. This is hybridization. They're combining DNA from different species, possibly even extraterrestrial material, to create something entirely new. A grim realization. As the officers secured the warehouse and cataloged the evidence, Jim couldn't shake the weight of what they had uncovered. This wasn't just about wildlife trafficking. It was about altering the fabric of life itself. The implications were staggering, and the questions loomed large. Who was funding this? How far had the research spread? And what would happen if these creatures were unleashed into the world? Harris placed a hand on Jim's shoulder. "This is just the beginning, Stevenson. We've uncovered a piece of something much bigger. But thanks to you, we've stopped it here." Jim nodded, though his relief was tempered by unease. The park was safe for now, but the larger threat remained. As he looked at the glowing eggs and the creature in the tank, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The larger threat. The discovery at the warehouse lingered in Jim's mind as the operation wound down. The police had secured dozens of crates filled with glowing eggs, confiscated strange machines, and arrested additional suspects hiding on the premises. The smugglers' equipment, notebooks, and vials hinted at a web of activity stretching far beyond the park. Yet, even with the immediate threat neutralized, the implications of what they had found gnawed at him. Jim sat with Officer Harris and Dr. Carter in the makeshift command center set up near the warehouse. The room buzzed with activity as officers cataloged evidence and coordinated with federal agencies. Maps, notes, and photographs covered the walls, painting a fragmented picture of a global operation. Dr. Carter leaned over a table, examining one of the confiscated vials under a portable microscope. "This liquid is fascinating," she said, her voice tinged with both awe and concern. "It's a biostimulant, likely used to accelerate the incubation of the eggs. But the molecular structure, it's not entirely terrestrial." Jim frowned, his arms crossed. "Not terrestrial. Are you saying it's alien?" Dr. Carter glanced at him, her expression serious. "I'm saying it's unlike anything found on Earth. It's possible these smugglers acquired it from a lab experimenting with extraterrestrial materials, or worse, directly from a source we don't even know exists." Harris, leaning back in his chair, let out a heavy sigh. "We're dealing with something bigger than just illegal animal trafficking. This is bioterrorism, or some high-level genetic engineering operation. Either way, it's beyond our jurisdiction." The smugglers' network. As the night deepened, a team from a federal agency arrived, their presence adding another layer of intensity to the operation. Suited agents, equipped with advanced technology, began analyzing the evidence and questioning the captured smugglers. Jim felt a sense of relief. Finally, the weight of the investigation wasn't solely on his shoulders, but also unease. Would these agents prioritize uncovering the truth or burying it? One of the agents, a sharp-eyed man named Agent Collins, approached Jim and Harris. "You've done excellent work here," he said, flipping through a thick file of notes. "This operation has been on our radar for months, but we didn't have the resources to track it down. The evidence you've gathered is invaluable." Jim straightened. "What's the scope of this operation? What are we really dealing with here?" Collins hesitated before answering. "This isn't just about the park or even the warehouse. These smugglers are part of an international network trafficking in genetically engineered organisms. Some of these creatures are designed for profit. Exotic pets, black market attractions. Others," he paused, glancing at Dr. Carter, "others are weapons." "Weapons," Harris repeated, his voice heavy with disbelief. Collins nodded. "Imagine creatures engineered for specific purposes: spying, sabotage, even combat. These smugglers were testing the viability of introducing these organisms into natural environments. If they'd succeeded, these eggs would have hatched, and who knows what kind of damage the creatures could have caused." Jim felt his chest tighten. "And the eggs we found in the park, were they weapons?" "Unlikely," Collins replied. "They seem more experimental, prototypes, perhaps, but they were dangerous enough. If those hawks hadn't abandoned their nest, the park's ecosystem could have been irreparably damaged." The escape of the unknown. As the federal agents worked, an alarming report came over the radio. One of the officers stationed near the warehouse perimeter had found an empty crate deep in the woods. The crate, marked with the same coordinates as the others, was partially broken, its contents missing. "What was in the crate?" Jim asked, already fearing the answer. "3 eggs," the officer replied. "There's no sign of them, or whoever might have taken them." A heavy silence fell over the group. If the eggs had hatched, the creatures could be anywhere. And if someone had taken them, they could be on their way to another location. Agent Collins immediately took charge. "We need search teams in the area. Secure every trail, every exit. If these creatures are loose, we can't afford to let them spread." Jim, Harris, and Dr. Carter joined the search, moving through the dense forest with flashlights and tracking equipment. The woods were eerily quiet, the usual nocturnal sounds replaced by an oppressive stillness. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent a wave of tension through the group. As they moved deeper into the forest, Jim spotted something unusual, a faint trail of glowing fluid on the ground. "Over here," he called, kneeling to examine it. The substance shimmered faintly, its color matching the glow of the eggs. It led deeper into the woods, winding between the trees like a path left by something moving low to the ground. "Whatever hatched from those eggs left this trail," Dr. Carter said, her voice low. "We need to be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with." The confrontation. The team followed the glowing trail, which led to a secluded clearing near the edge of the park. There, amidst the underbrush, they found signs of a struggle. Torn branches, disturbed soil, and more of the glowing fluid. But what caught Jim's attention was a strange object embedded in a tree, a shard of metallic material, similar to the device found in the nest. "It's like they're leaving breadcrumbs," Jim said, pulling the shard free and examining it. "But why?" Before anyone could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing. The team froze, their flashlights sweeping the darkness. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a rustling in the bushes. Suddenly, something darted into the light. A creature, no larger than a house cat, but unlike anything Jim had ever seen. Its body was sleek and reptilian, with scales that shimmered like liquid metal. It had elongated limbs and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the night. "Don't move," Dr. Carter whispered, her gaze fixed on the creature. "It's assessing us." The creature hissed, its movements unnaturally quick as it circled the group. Then, with a burst of speed, it leaped toward one of the agents, who barely dodged in time. The clearing erupted into chaos as the team tried to subdue the creature without harming it. The final capture. Jim grabbed a net from his pack, stepping carefully toward the creature as it lashed out at the agents. "We need it alive," he shouted. "If we kill it, we lose any chance of understanding what they've done." The creature lunged at him, its sharp claws narrowly missing his arm. Jim reacted quickly, tossing the net over it and pinning it to the ground. The creature thrashed wildly, emitting a high-pitched screech that made Jim's ears ring. Dr. Carter rushed forward, administering a sedative from one of the confiscated vials. Within moments, the creature stilled, its glowing eyes dimming as it fell unconscious. The team secured it in a reinforced cage, their relief palpable. A new mission. Back at the station, the captured creature was placed under observation. Dr. Carter worked tirelessly to study its biology, while Agent Collins coordinated the next steps with federal agencies. The smugglers' operation had been dismantled, but the loose ends, the missing eggs, the strange devices, and the broader implications of the genetic experiments remained. Jim sat outside the station, watching as dawn broke over the park. The events of the past few days had shaken him to his core, but they had also reinforced his resolve. The park was his responsibility, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. Harris joined him, handing over a cup of coffee. "You did good, Stevenson. Better than good." Jim nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. "This isn't over, is it?" Harris sighed. "Not by a long shot. But thanks to you, We've got a fighting chance. As the first rays of sunlight touched the treetops, Jim made a silent vow. Whatever came next, whether it was more smugglers, new creatures, or the shadowy organization behind it all, he would be ready. The park was more than his workplace. It was his home. And he'd defend it, no matter the cost. The hidden threat. As Jim sat outside the ranger station, sipping his coffee, the park's serene morning ambience felt almost surreal. The events of the night weighed heavily on his mind, but he knew there was no time to dwell on them. The creature they had captured wasn't just a clue, it was a warning. If even one of the eggs had hatched into something this dangerous, what else could be out there? Inside the station, Dr. Carter worked tirelessly in the makeshift lab, examining the unconscious creature under carefully controlled conditions. Jim joined her, peering over her shoulder as she meticulously documented every detail. "This thing's biology is astounding," Carter murmured, her voice tinged with awe. "Its muscles are denser than anything I've seen, yet its movements are faster than most predators. Its scales are nearly impenetrable. And look at this." She pointed to its claws. "They're coated in a natural toxin." Jim frowned. "A toxin? You mean it's venomous?" Carter nodded. "Highly. It's designed for hunting, quick kills, adaptability, and efficiency. This isn't an accident of nature. It's a deliberate creation." Jim's mind raced. Could it be some kind of prototype? A test run for something bigger? "Possibly," Carter admitted. "But here's what worries me most. Its growth rate. Based on what we've seen, this creature hatched less than 24 hours ago. Its size and development suggest it's been engineered to mature rapidly. If any other eggs have hatched, they might already be fully grown, and far more dangerous." The search for answers. As Carter continued her examination, Agent Collins returned with new intelligence. He laid a stack of files on the table, his expression grim. "We've uncovered some preliminary details about the smugglers' network. They weren't just traffickers, they were contractors. The organization funding this operation is called Helix Genesis." Jim raised an eyebrow. "Helix Genesis? Never heard of it." "You wouldn't have," Collins replied. "They operate in the shadows, private labs, offshore facilities, anonymous investors. They specialize in genetic engineering, pushing boundaries most governments wouldn't dare touch. Their work ranges from medical breakthroughs to military applications." "And these eggs?" Jim asked. "What were they planning to do with them?" Collins hesitated. "From what we've gathered, these creatures were meant to be released into controlled environments for testing. The ultimate goal appears to be creating hybrid organisms capable of thriving in extreme conditions. Deserts, Arctic tundras, even toxic wastelands. If successful, they could revolutionize environmental restoration or weaponize ecosystems." Jim felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "And our park? Was it just a test site?" Collins nodded. "A convenient one. Remote, heavily wooded, and under your radar. They likely plan to collect data from the eggs' hatching and growth cycles, then move their operation elsewhere." The trail goes cold. The remaining missing eggs remained the top priority. Search teams scoured the forest, but the thick foliage and rugged terrain made tracking difficult. Jim joined the effort, his trained eye scanning for any signs of the glowing fluid trail they had followed the night before. After hours of searching, one of the teams radioed in. "We found something near the eastern ridge, a cave system. There's glowing fluid at the entrance, and it looks like something's been nesting inside." Jim and Collins arrived at the location, their flashlights piercing the cave's dark interior. The air was damp and cold, and the faint hum of dripping water echoed through the narrow passageways. As they ventured deeper, the glowing fluid became more pronounced, splattered across the walls, and pooling in small puddles. Then they saw it, a makeshift nest constructed from broken branches, torn bark, and shredded leaves. In the center lay 2 eggs, one intact, the other cracked open. The sight sent a wave of dread through the group. "The third egg," Jim whispered. It's hatched. Suddenly, a low growl reverberated through the cave. The group froze, their flashlights darting toward the sound. From the shadows emerged a creature, larger than the one they had captured, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Its sleek, scaled body rippled with tension as it crouched, ready to strike. A desperate stand. "Hold your fire," Jim ordered as the officers raised their weapons. "We can't risk damaging the nest or the eggs." The creature hissed, bearing sharp, venom-coated fangs. It moved with terrifying speed, circling the group and testing their defenses. Jim could see the intelligence in its glowing eyes. It wasn't just a mindless predator. This thing was thinking, strategizing. Dr. Carter, who had joined the team to examine the nest, whispered, "We need to distract it. If we can separate it from the eggs, we might have a chance to subdue it." Jim nodded. "I'll draw its attention. You secure the eggs." Before anyone could protest, Jim stepped forward, waving his flashlight to catch the creature's gaze. "Hey, over here," he shouted, his voice echoing through the cave. The creature snarled and lunged, its movements a blur. Jim dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its claws. He scrambled to his feet, backing away as it pursued him deeper into the cave. His heart pounded as he led it away from the nest, the confined space leaving little room for error. Meanwhile, Carter and the officers moved quickly, carefully retrieving the eggs and securing them in protective cases. "Got them," Carter called out. "Let's move." Hearing her voice, Jim made a break for the cave entrance, the creature hot on his heels. As he emerged into the daylight, the team was ready. A large net, rigged with tranquilizers, was launched over the creature, tangling its limbs and delivering a powerful sedative. It thrashed for a moment before collapsing in a heap. The fallout. Back at the ranger station, the captured creature was placed in a secure enclosure alongside its smaller counterpart. Dr. Carter worked tirelessly to analyze the eggs and the creatures, her findings painting an increasingly disturbing picture. "These creatures aren't just hybrids," she explained during a debriefing. "They're designed to evolve. Their DNA contains adaptive coding, meaning they could develop new traits based on their environment. If even one escaped into the wild, it could wreak havoc on local ecosystems." Agent Collins nodded grimly. Helix Genesis wasn't just testing these creatures. They were planning to release them globally. If they'd succeeded, they could have created an ecological disaster. Jim leaned forward. "What happens now?" Collins glanced at him. "The creatures, the eggs, and all associated evidence will be transported to a secure facility for further study. Helix Genesis will face federal investigation, and we'll dismantle their operations piece by piece." "And the park?" Jim asked. "What about the damage already done?" Collins placed a reassuring hand on Jim's shoulder. "You've done more than anyone could have expected, Stevenson. The park is safe, for now." A new resolve. As the federal agents departed with the evidence, Jim remained behind to oversee the park's recovery. The hawks had returned to their nest, their cries echoing once more through the trees. The glowing trails had faded, and the forest seemed to breathe again. But Jim knew the battle wasn't over. Helix Genesis was still out there, and the threat of their experiments loomed large. He vowed to remain vigilant, to protect the park and its inhabitants from whatever dangers lay ahead. As he walked the familiar trails, the weight of the past few days began to lift. The park was his responsibility, his sanctuary, and he would defend it with everything he had. For now, the forest was quiet. But Jim knew the silence wouldn't last forever, and when the next storm came, he would be ready.